Vladimir Putin's brain, and I work on this, particularly thinking about nuclear strategy for US Stratcom, with people who work on nuclear weapons. And Vladimir Putin is a master of using fear, of eliciting fear in others. He describes fear beautifully and how he elicits fear and how he understands fear in his quasi-autobiography that he published a couple of decades ago. He is very clever, he is very capable, but he also sits atop a country that is fundamentally weaker.
Now, look, we talk a lot about war on the show because unfortunately the world feels like quite a dangerous place. And we also discuss the various methods that we seem to have devised for killing each other, from guns to missiles to drones. We spend less time talking about the minds of the people directing those conflicts, the minds of dictators like Vladimir Putin, and the minds of our own leaders who have to decide how to respond. Well, Nicholas Wright is a neuroscientist who has spent more than a decade advising both the Pentagon and the UK government. In his new book, Warhead, How the Brain Shapes War and War Shapes the Brain, he attempts to understand war by looking inside our heads. And he joins me now. Nicholas, hello.
Hi, Hugo.
Thanks very much for being with us. Look, just to be clear, you haven't actually studied the inside of Vladimir Putin's head.
I think that's a very well-protected cranium. Yeah.
Tell us about this book. Tell us about what you're doing with it.
Yeah. So, as you said, I'm a neuroscientist. So I spent many years. I was a neurology doctor in Oxford and London, and was involved in neurosurgery, and then used functional brain imaging and other technologies to look at the brain. And I've spent the last 10 years, over 10 years now, advising the Pentagon Joint Staff in particular on how they can use the really exciting new ideas we're finding out about the brain and apply those to decision-making in international conflicts. And I think the thing to remember is that throughout history, humans have always faced life and death emergencies, throughout prehistory too. And so every brain, your brain, my brain, every listener's brain, is built to win or at least survive a fight. Right, that's human against nature or human against human. And as you travel through the brain, and that's what I do in the book, starting at the brainstem right at the very bottom and then ending at the frontal pole, which is the most, just behind the forehead, which is the most very distinctively human region of the brain, every part of that brain can help drive us towards conflict. Right, take fear. Right, we think of fear as something we don't necessarily want, but actually fear is useful. If you lack the part of the brain which is sort of deep down inside the brain called the amygdala, and I've treated some patients or seen some patients who have lacking this part of the brain, the amygdala. If you lack fear, it doesn't mean that you become a fearless criminal who can take whatever you want without fear of consequences. What it means is that actually you become a victim of crime, because if you can't see fear in others and you can't feel fear yourself, right, you can't act appropriately, you can't avoid dangerous situations. So we need fear. Fear is useful, but it can drive us towards conflict.
That's fascinating. Look, so you talk about various military leaders and the cognitive capabilities they could have had that helped them win when they won. You write about what Nelson did, or what the attributes Nelson had that helped him win the Battle of Trafalgar. Explain that to us.
So, well, Nelson is a great example because, and the way I talk about Nelson in the book is I talk about here a region of the brain called the hippocampus, right, the hippocampal entorhinal cortex. And this part of the brain illustrates a really important thing about how our brains work. Our brains use models of the world. And these models of the world are not metaphors. We don't metaphorically have a model of the world in the brain. We literally, you right now, physically have a model of the world in your brain. Right, a model of the physical world, a map of the world. And so we can see this in rodents. So, for example, we see in rodents, you can put in a grid of electrodes in their hippocampus, and then you can let the rodent run around, right, in the real world, and you can see exactly where the rodent is in the real world just by reading off where is active in their map that's in their hippocampus.
Wow, right.
And so Nelson...
You've not done this with Nelson, but...
I mean, he died some considerable time before I died. But Right, that's how our brains, right, that's how we navigate. That's how he navigated. He must have had a great hippocampal entorhinal cortex, okay? That is how he navigated.
So he knew what ships were where, he knew...
Exactly. And you see this throughout history. And for example, we know that as you become better, for example, at learning new things, taxi drivers is a famous example that, again, happened at my lab in London at Queen's Square, just up the road from where we're recording this. They studied London taxi drivers and London taxi drivers' brains when they learned the knowledge, which is this deep knowledge of London landmarks and navigation systems. Their brains, their hippocampus changed, right? And what we also know is that we can use this knowledge of how we can make maps of the world, of incredibly abstract terrains like outer space, right, the 3D orbits of outer space. And I work with space warriors before they set up Space Command in the US, right? And there are people who really do this, a lot of them, for their living. They have to think in 3Ds and orbits, right? Or, for example, cyberspace, Again, I've worked with people who work on cyber, and you have to think about cyber. And for example, this also tells us a lot about where AI is going. So Demis Hassabis, so both last year's Nobel Prizes in AI, they were both by people who were card-carrying neuroscientists, right, and were at Queen Square, which is the research institute I work at just up the road from here. So Demis Hassabis and I, we had desks in the same office for a while whilst he was finishing his PhD and I was starting mine. And Demis looked specifically at the hippocampus, right? That was what he looked at. And the hippocampus is very important for memories. You can put memories, different analogies next to each other, compare them. And his PhD was about how the hippocampus is important for doing that, and then imagining the future. And that's been important for how he has progressed. Working on AI, for example.
Tell us about the Nazi blitzkrieg of 1940 and how that kind of exploited vulnerabilities in the brain, understood what people would find particularly disturbing because of the makeup of our brain.
I mean, you can say that there is no more important historical event, right, than the 6 and a bit weeks of the Battle of France, right, when France was defeated. So we think now the Nazi war machine was unstoppable, but it wasn't unstoppable, right? On May the 9th, 1940, the defenders of France, which is the British and the French, right, we had more trained men, more guns, more tanks, more planes. Right, the French army was considered the strongest army in the world, right? And yet, less than 7 weeks later, Hitler's cavalry was clattering up the Champs-Élysées in a victory parade, right? Why did that happen? The first thing is that the Germans, and it gives me no pleasure to say this, were simply much better than we were at thinking faster than the enemy, making decisions faster, and in particular, using surprise. Right, they were much better at using surprise. They shocked the enemy, and they used skill, will, and daring to shock the French. And unfortunately, the French collapsed.
Does that mean they had better brains for war, or they picked the people who had the better brains for war?
They picked better people. They trained them better, and they used them better with the technologies of their time. Right, their tanks were not better than our tanks. Their planes were not really any better than our planes. They used what they had better, and the reason why that's so important is that. Right now, for example, if we think about a future war with China, and that's what I spend a lot of my time doing, and bear in mind that what people are planning for in the Ministry of Defence and in the Pentagon is a world war, right? That involves both China over somewhere like Taiwan and the Middle East, for example, with Iran, and in Europe, right, with Russia. That's what people are actually planning for. Most people in Britain don't really know that, but that is what people are actually planning for. Now, if we enter that kind of war, we will not be materially superior. We will be, certainly if it becomes a prolonged war, we will be materially inferior, right? China now produces as much stuff, manufactures as much stuff as the next 4 or maybe even 9 countries in the world combined, and it's not just that they have a bigger manufacturing sector. In many ways, it's better than any of our manufacturing sectors. They now have more robots per industrial worker than any G7 country.
Do they have better brains as well?
Well, one of the challenges we have is that a lot of this stuff only comes out in the wash, right? You get the audit of war. We don't know, right? Yeah. The French had won a world war, right? They literally won World War One.
Look, we're nearly out of time. So, and your book is too interesting, and I haven't been able to ask you about nearly half the stuff I wanted to. But let's bring it back to Vladimir Putin's brain. What can you tell us about Vladimir Putin's brain?
I would say that Vladimir Putin's brain, and I work on this, particularly thinking about nuclear strategy for US Stratcom with people who work on nuclear weapons, and Vladimir Putin is a master of using fear, of eliciting fear in others. He describes fear beautifully and how he elicits fear and how he understands fear in his quasi-autobiography that he published a couple of decades ago. He is very clever, he is very capable, but he also sits atop a country that is fundamentally weaker in many ways than our Western countries, even though we seem like flabby Western liberals and all the rest of it. We are much stronger than him, and I am confident that and I'm optimistic, right, that we can deter him, and if necessary, and we have to fight him, that we could beat him in Europe.
Is there something about warlike people that they have a different sort of brain? People who want to conquer, that they have a different sort of brain? Do they have a bit of their brain that is bigger than other sorts of brain, a bit of their brain that is dominant over other parts of their brain?
I mean, I think you're here on the radio, right? You like other people saying, wow, Hugo's show is really great, and all the rest of it. I mean, I'm sure that they do, right? The idea that these people are so radically different, if you take war out, I mean, war is a constant feature of human history, right? Striving competition is a constant feature of human history. Yes, these people, there will always be more Putins, there will always be more Hitlers, there will always be more Osama bin Ladens. But then we must also remember that reconciliation is equally human. Conflict is always part of us, and there will always be extreme individuals. But then reconciliation is equally part of what it is to be human, right? And if we ignore either the war part or the reconciliation part, we're only seeing half the picture. Right, and that's what we need in our time. We need to be wiser, and we need to see ourselves as we really are. And I think that through that self-knowledge, for example, and obviously I would say this, but most importantly, through what we're learning about the brain, gives us a new source of self-knowledge, and that can make a more peaceful world.
So better at war, better at peace as well, if only we know more about the brain. Nicholas Wright, thank you so much. Completely fascinating. The book is War, How the Brain Shapes War and War Shapes the Brain. It's out now.